Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Chris Patterson, and I've been a forest ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in October 2018. And it changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd sworn to protect. More importantly, it changed what I knew about myself. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I was checking my gear in the Mammoth Hot Springs Ranger Station when my radio crackled to life with a call that would haunt me for months to come. Unit 47, we've got a code yellow at coordinates 44.9778 degree N, 110.6968 degree W. Missing hiker, Rachel Cooper, age 24, reported overdue by her camping partner, dispatch announced through the static. I grabbed my standard SR pack, 60-pound load with rope, medical supplies, emergency shelter, GPS unit, and enough food and water for 3 days. The familiar weight settled across my shoulders like an old friend, though my stomach had that tight feeling it always got on missing person calls. Ever since the Morrison incident 3 years ago, I couldn't shake the image of finding someone too late. The coordinates placed Rachel's last known location near the Specimen Ridge Trail, a moderately difficult day hike that wound through dense lodgepole pine forest. As I drove my Ranger 404 toward the trailhead, October air sharp with the scent of dying leaves and early snow, I tried to focus on standard protocol rather than the what-ifs. Rachel's camping partner, a nervous college student named Derek, met me at the trailhead parking area. His hands shook as he chain-smoked cigarettes, and his eyes were red-rimmed from what looked like a sleepless night. She said she was just going for a quick morning hike, Derek explained, his voice cracking. That was yesterday at 7 a.m. She had her day pack, water bottle, some trail mix. Said she'd be back by noon to break camp. I pulled out my incident report tablet, fingers already stiff from the cold morning air. Did she mention which trail specifically? Specimen Ridge. She wanted to see the petrified trees. Derek dropped his cigarette and immediately lit another one. But here's the thing that's really messing with my head, man. This morning I found her water bottle. He led me 20 yards from the parking area to a picnic table. There, sitting perfectly centered on the weathered wood surface, was a pink Nalgene bottle with Rachel written in black Sharpie. My mouth went dry, and I felt that familiar tightness creep up from my chest toward my throat. You're certain this is hers? Positive. She never goes anywhere without that bottle. But Chris, Derek's voice dropped to almost a whisper. That table was completely empty when I went to bed last night. I know because I sat there for 2 hours waiting for her to come back, and this morning there it was, like someone just placed it there. I picked up the bottle, noting the condensation still clinging to the inside. It was half full, and when I unscrewed the cap, the water smelled fresh. No stagnant odor you'd expect from sitting out overnight. The impossible part was that the Specimen Ridge trailhead was a full 2-mile hike from this parking area, through terrain that would take at least an hour to navigate in daylight. Derek, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any chance you moved this here and forgot? No way. His denial was immediate and emphatic. I've been awake all night. I would have seen anyone approach this table. I sealed the bottle in an evidence bag, though some instinct I couldn't name told me this was beyond anything that would make sense to the lab techs back in Mammoth. My radio squawked with morning check-ins from other units, the familiar voices of my colleagues going through their daily routines while I stood staring at an object that shouldn't exist in this location. Derek, I'm going to start a grid search of the Specimen Ridge area. I need you to stay here in case Rachel returns and call this number immediately if you see or hear anything unusual. I handed him my supervisor's direct line. Anything at all, no matter how strange it seems. The Specimen Ridge Trail began as a gentle incline through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, their trunks straight as telephone poles reaching toward an overcast sky that promised snow before evening. My boots crunched on a carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves painted gold and deep red. The familiar sounds of the forest surrounded me, red squirrels chattering in the canopy, the distant hammering of a pileated woodpecker, wind whistling through the branches with that hollow sound that always reminded me of winter's approach. I followed standard search protocol, calling Rachel's name every 50 yards and listening for response. Rachel Cooper!" My voice echoed off the surrounding ridges and faded into the forest silence. After each call, I stood motionless for 30 seconds, straining to hear any human sound over the natural symphony of the woods. 2 hours into the search, I reached the main attraction of the Specimen Ridge Trail, a grove of petrified trees that had stood here for millions of years, ancient sentinels turned to stone. It was here that I found the first real evidence of Rachel's passage, a granola bar wrapper caught in the low branches of a serviceberry bush. But it was what I found next that made my hands start trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the October cold. 20 yards beyond the petrified grove, I discovered a trail I'd never seen before. I'd hiked every maintained trail in this section of Yellowstone dozens of times over my 12-year career. I knew every junction, every overlook, every game trail that branched off the main routes. But here, cutting through the forest at a perfect 90-degree angle to the Specimen Ridge Trail, was a clear, well-worn path that appeared on none of my topographic maps. The trail was about 4 feet wide, with the kind of packed earth that came from years of regular use. Fallen logs had been cleared away, and someone had even placed flat stones across the small creek crossings. It looked like official Park Service work, except no work orders had been issued for this area, and I would have known about any new trail construction. My GPS unit showed my position as 44.9892 degree N, 110.71, 44 degrees W. But when I tried to get a satellite lock on the mysterious trail itself, the display flickered and showed no signal, despite having perfect reception just moments before. I pulled out my radio to report the discovery to dispatch, but all I got was static. The squelch broke occasionally with fragments of what sounded like voices, but not the clear communications I should have been receiving from the Mammoth Station just 12 miles away. Every instinct I'd developed over a decade in search and rescue was screaming at me to head back, call for backup, and return with a full team. But lying next to the trail entrance, partially hidden under a scatter of pine needles, was Rachel's red baseball cap. I picked up the cap and felt something inside my chest twist tight. The fabric was still warm, as if she'd just taken it off moments ago. But more disturbing was what I noticed as I knelt there. Fresh footprints in the soft earth leading down the mysterious trail. The tread pattern looked like hiking boots size 7 or 8, which matched the description Derek had given me of Rachel's footwear. Standing at the trail entrance, I felt a sensation I'd never experienced before in my years as a ranger. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. The normal sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant whisper of wind through the canopy, had gone completely silent. Even the ever-present drone of insects had ceased. I thought about Tommy Morrison, the 10-year-old boy I'd failed to find 3 years ago. By the time we'd located his body, hypothermia had taken him just 200 yards from where his family was camped. I'd followed protocol that day, too, waited for backup, coordinated with Incident Command, and Tommy had died alone in the dark while I filled out paperwork. Rachel's trail of evidence led down this impossible path, and I could feel precious daylight burning away with each moment of hesitation. My emergency pack contained enough supplies for 3 days, and my personal locator beacon would bring help if I got into serious trouble. I keyed my radio one more time, hoping for a clear signal. "Mammoth Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm pursuing a lead on the missing hiker at coordinates." The static swallowed my words, but I continued the transmission anyway, describing the mysterious trail and my intention to follow it. With Rachel's cap secured in my pack next to her water bottle, I stepped onto the unknown trail. The path descended gradually through dense forest, winding between massive Douglas firs that seemed older and larger than any I'd seen in this part of the park. Their trunks were easily 6 feet in diameter, their canopy so thick that the forest floor lay in perpetual twilight, despite the midday hour. After 15 minutes of hiking, I noticed something that made me stop and check my compass. According to my instrument, I was heading due north, but the trail felt like it was descending toward the east. I took another reading, then another, but the compass needle pointed steadily north even as my inner ear insisted I was traveling in a completely different direction. The wrongness of it made my shoulders pull up toward my ears, muscles bunching tight with tension I couldn't explain. My peripheral vision seemed to narrow as if I were looking down a tunnel, and I had to consciously force myself to scan the forest around me rather than stare fixedly at the trail ahead. That's when I noticed the trees. Every Douglas fir along the trail had a mark carved into its bark at eye level, a simple vertical line about 4 inches long, cut deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath. The marks were old, the edges weathered and darkened with age, but they were clearly deliberate. Someone had marked this trail, and they'd done it years ago. I pulled out my camera and photographed several of the marked trees, though the images came out strangely dark despite my flash. When I reviewed them on the camera's LCD screen, the tree marks appeared as jagged black scars that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. 45 minutes down the trail, I found Rachel's day pack. It was sitting upright in the center of the path, every zipper closed, looking as if she'd carefully placed it there and walked away. I approached cautiously, photographing it from multiple angles before touching anything. The pack showed no signs of struggle, no tears or dirt that would indicate it had been dropped or abandoned in haste. Inside, I found all the gear Derek had mentioned: trail mix, energy bars, a fleece jacket, a basic first aid kit. Her wallet was there too, containing her driver's license, credit cards, and $43 in cash. Nothing was missing, nothing disturbed. But underneath the pack, pressed into the soft earth, was a message scratched into the dirt. "Help me. R." The letters were shaky but clearly formed, as if Rachel had used a stick or her finger to write them. But what made my breath catch in my throat was that the message appeared to be fresh. The scratched earth was still moist, the edges of the letters sharp and undisturbed by weather. I checked my watch. 2:17 p.m. Rachel had been missing for over 30 hours, but this message looked like it had been written within the last few hours. At this point, I should have turned back. But would you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe if you're enjoying this terrifying tale. I secured Rachel's pack with my own gear and continued down the trail, driven by a growing certainty that I was close to finding her. The marked trees continued at regular intervals, and I began to notice a pattern in their placement. Every tree bore the same vertical scar, but some had additional marks, small notches cut below the main line, like a crude tallying system. The first marked tree had 1 notch, the second had 2, the third had 3. I was so focused on the pattern that I almost missed the moment when everything changed. Between one step and the next, the forest around me transformed. The towering Douglas firs gave way to smaller lodgepole pines, their bark scarred by some long-ago fire. The trail surface changed from soft earth to loose scree and exposed granite. Most jarring of all, the light changed from the cool twilight of deep forest to the harsh glare of late afternoon sun. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see the path I'd just traveled, but there was nothing behind me except a sheer rock face that rose 30 feet into the air. The trail simply ended at the base of the cliff, as if I'd somehow materialized at this spot rather than hiked here. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled out my GPS unit. The display showed my coordinates as 44.892 degen, 110.8234 dW, a location that placed me nearly 15 miles southeast of where I'd started, in an area of the park I'd never visited. According to the GPS, I'd somehow traveled a distance that should have taken 6 hours of hard hiking and less than 2 hours of walking. But the GPS readings weren't the most disturbing part. According to the unit's internal clock, it was 4:47 p.m. I looked at my watch. 2:23 p.m. The GPS insisted I'd lost over 2 hours somewhere on that impossible trail. I tried my radio again, cycling through all the emergency frequencies. Nothing but static, occasionally broken by what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sounds were too distorted to make out clearly, but they carried an urgent, pleading quality that made the hair on my forearms stand up. The trail continued ahead of me, winding up through a landscape that looked like no part of Yellowstone I'd ever seen. Strange rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the few trees that grew here were stunted and twisted into unnatural shapes. The air itself felt different, thinner somehow, with a metallic taste that reminded me of the smell before lightning strikes. And there, maybe 100 yards ahead, I saw movement. A figure in dark clothing was walking away from me up the trail, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Even at a distance, I could see it was a woman with long, dark hair, the same description Derek had given me of Rachel. "Rachel!" I shouted, my voice echoing strangely off the surrounding rocks. "Rachel Cooper!" The figure stopped and turned around. Even across the distance, I could see her wave at me before turning and continuing up the trail. She was moving fast, faster than someone should be able to walk uphill, but she was definitely heading away from me. I broke into a run. The trail was steeper here, and the thin air made my lungs burn with each breath. My pack bounced against my back, the familiar weight now feeling like it was trying to drag me backward down the slope. But I kept Rachel in sight, following her around switchbacks and over rocky outcrops that shouldn't have existed in this part of Wyoming. Every time I thought I was gaining ground, she would disappear around another bend, always staying just out of conversational distance. I called her name repeatedly, but she never answered, never slowed down, never looked back again. As I climbed higher, I began to notice more of the marked trees. The vertical scars were deeper here, cut all the way through the bark to the wood beneath, and the notch counts were getting higher, 15, 20, 25 marks below each main scar. Some trees had so many notches that they covered the entire visible trunk, like a tally of years or decades. It was at the tree marked with 47 notches that I finally understood what I was looking at. Carved into the bark above the notches, in letters that were deep and old but still clearly readable, was a name. Ranger T. Morrison, 1971. My knees went weak, and I had to grab the tree trunk to keep from falling. Thomas Morrison had been a Yellowstone Ranger in the early 1970s, one of the first Native American Rangers hired by the Park Service. According to the official records, he disappeared during a routine patrol in 1971 and was never found. The search had lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles. But here was his name, carved into a tree in a place that didn't appear on any map, along a trail that shouldn't exist. And if my count was right, there were 47 notches below his name, one for each year since he'd disappeared. I looked ahead up the trail, and the figure I'd been following was gone. The path continued upward, disappearing around a massive boulder that looked like it had been balanced there by some giant hand. But now I wasn't sure if I'd been chasing Rachel Cooper or the ghost of a ranger who'd been lost for nearly 5 decades. My radio crackled with a burst of clear signal, and I heard my own voice say, "Mammoth Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm pursuing a lead on the missing hiker." It was the transmission I'd made hours ago when I first found the trail, but it was playing back to me with perfect clarity. As I listened, other voices joined the transmission. Different rangers, different years, all reporting missing persons along trails that didn't exist. That's when I felt it for the first time. Something was moving in my mind, like fingers pushing gently against the inside of my skull. Not painful, but unmistakably foreign, as if someone else's thoughts were trying to make room alongside my own. I could suddenly sense things I shouldn't be able to sense. The exact location of every marked tree along the trail behind me, the presence of something large moving through the forest below, and most disturbing of all, the growing certainty that I wasn't alone in my own head. "Follow the trail," a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if I was hearing it with my ears or directly in my mind. "Complete the path. Join us." I stumbled backward from the marked tree, my vision swimming as competing thoughts crashed together in my consciousness. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, to get as far away from this impossible place as possible, but another part, a part that felt foreign and cold, wanted nothing more than to continue up the trail, to see where it led, to add my own mark to one of those ancient trees. The struggle in my mind was like trying to think through thick fog, but gradually I became aware that the foreign presence wasn't trying to control me. It was trying to warn me. Images flashed behind my eyes, other rangers walking this same trail. their faces filled with the same determination that had driven me to follow Rachel's trail of evidence. I saw Thomas Morrison carving his name into the tree, his hands moving without his conscious control. I saw others, dozens of them over the decades, each one drawn here by missing persons cases that left impossible evidence. And I saw what waited at the end of the trail. The path led to a clearing at the top of the ridge where a ring of ancient stones surrounded a depression in the earth that seemed to pull light into itself like a black hole. Around the stones sat figures in ranger uniforms from different eras, their faces blank and their eyes reflecting no light. They were waiting, all of them, for something that would complete their circle. "The trail feeds on purpose," the voice in my mind explained, and I realized it was Thomas Morrison's consciousness somehow preserved in this place. It draws those who search for the lost, but the lost are already here, and the searchers become the searched. I understood then that Rachel Cooper wasn't missing. She was bait, like all the others had been bait. The trail created the evidence, manufactured the clues, drew in anyone with enough determination to ignore common sense in pursuit of saving someone. But understanding the trap didn't make escaping it any easier. When I tried to turn around and head back down the trail, my legs wouldn't obey. They continued walking upward, carrying me toward the clearing despite every conscious effort to stop. The foreign presence in my mind, Morrison's warnings, grew fainter as something else took control of my motor functions. "Fight it," Morrison's voice whispered urgently. "You have something we didn't have, something new." That's when I felt it, the change that had been building in me since I first stepped onto the impossible trail. My senses were expanding beyond their normal limits. I could feel the life force of every tree, every plant, every insect in the forest around me. More than that, I could sense the boundaries between the natural world and whatever unnatural force had created this place. The trail wasn't just supernatural. It was like a parasite, feeding on the landscape around it and twisting reality to serve its hunger. But parasites had weaknesses, and my newfound sensitivity was showing me exactly where this one was vulnerable. I stopped fighting my legs and let them carry me up toward the clearing, but I used the time to explore my expanding abilities. I could feel the ley lines of natural energy that flowed through the earth like underground rivers, and I could sense where the trail had tapped into those lines to power its reality-bending effects. What I discovered filled me with both hope and terror. The trail was old, possibly ancient, but it wasn't all-powerful. It was like a complex machine that required constant maintenance, and that maintenance came from the consciousness of the people it trapped. Every ranger sitting in that circle was serving as a living battery, their minds enslaved to keep the trail functioning. But machines could be broken. When I reached the clearing, I saw them all exactly as Morrison's memories had shown me. 23 rangers from different decades sat motionless around the ring of stones, their uniforms ranging from the wool and leather of the 1940s to modern synthetic fabrics. Their eyes were open but empty, their breathing shallow and automatic, and there, in the center of the circle, was Rachel Cooper. She sat perfectly still in the depression at the center of the stone ring, her hands folded in her lap, her face serene. She looked exactly as Derek had described her, but her eyes held the same empty quality as the trapped rangers. She was alive but not present, her consciousness somewhere else entirely. "Sit," commanded the voice that had taken control of my legs. "Complete the circle. Feed the trail." My body moved toward an empty space in the ring of stones, but now I was ready. As my knees began to bend, I reached out with my new sensitivity and grabbed hold of the natural energy flowing beneath the clearing. It was like grasping a high-voltage electrical line with my bare hands. Pain shot through every nerve in my body, but I held on. The trail fought back immediately. Reality twisted around me like a kaleidoscope, showing me dozens of different versions of the clearing, all superimposed on each other. In some versions, I was already sitting in the circle, my mind empty and compliant. In others, I was running down the mountainside fleeing in terror. But in all of them, the trail continued to exist, continued to hunt. I focused on the one thing that remained constant across all the realities, the natural energy flowing through the earth. It was older than the trail, more fundamental, and it didn't belong to whatever force had created this trap. drawing on every ounce of determination I'd learned in 12 years of search and rescue work. I redirected that energy away from the trail's machinery and back into the natural world where it belonged. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The clearing exploded with light as decades of stored supernatural energy was suddenly released. The ring of stones cracked and crumbled, and the depression in the center of the circle collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder. The trapped rangers gasped and jerked as if waking from a deep sleep, their eyes clearing as their consciousness returned to their own bodies. Rachel Cooper screamed. It was a sound of pure terror and confusion, the cry of someone who had been lost in a nightmare and suddenly found herself back in the real world. I managed to reach her just as the clearing began to destabilize completely, the ground buckling and heaving as the trail's reality-warping effects collapsed. "Rachel, my name is Chris Patterson. I'm a park ranger. You're safe now." She looked at me with wild, frightened eyes, but there was recognition there. Human awareness returning after however long she'd been trapped in the trail's influence. "Where? How long?" she stammered, trying to stand on shaking legs. "Don't worry about that now. We need to get out of here." The other rangers were recovering more slowly, decades of mental imprisonment leaving them disoriented and weak. Thomas Morrison, the oldest of them, managed to struggle to his feet and point toward a section of the clearing that was still stable. "The real trail," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Back to the world." Where he pointed, I could see a familiar path leading downward through normal-looking forest. My expanded senses confirmed it. This was genuine park trail, connecting to the real world rather than the trail's pocket dimension. I helped Rachel to her feet and started moving toward the escape route, but she stopped and looked back at the other rangers. "What about them? We can't just leave them here." Morrison shook his head. "We've been gone too long. Decades, some of us. The world has moved on. But the young ones," he gestured toward 3 rangers whose uniforms marked them as recent victims. "They can still go home." The clearing was disintegrating around us, pieces of false reality cracking and falling away like broken glass. But my new sensitivity told me the effect was spreading. The entire trail network was collapsing, returning to normal forest as the supernatural machinery shut down. "Everyone who can walk, move now," I shouted, helping Rachel while Morrison and the other survivors guided their fellow rangers toward the real trail. We made it out just as the clearing imploded completely, leaving nothing behind but a natural meadow that showed no sign of ever having been disturbed by human presence. The hike back to the real world took 3 hours, following genuine park trails that appeared on actual maps. My GPS worked perfectly. My radio crackled with normal communications from the Mammoth station, and the sun moved across the sky in the predictable pattern I'd known all my life. Rachel stayed close to me during the entire descent, occasionally asking questions about where we were and how long she'd been missing. I told her the truth, that she'd been gone for about 36 hours, and that she'd been found safe and unharmed. I didn't try to explain the supernatural elements of her disappearance. Some experiences are too large to fit into words, and she would need time to process what had happened to her. When we reached the Specimen Ridge trailhead, Derek was exactly where I'd left him, still chain-smoking and pacing nervously around the picnic tables. His reaction when he saw Rachel was everything you'd expect. Tears, relief, questions fired so rapidly that neither of us could answer them. I radioed for medical evacuation, and within an hour, Rachel was on her way to the hospital in Jackson for observation. The doctors would find nothing wrong with her except mild dehydration and exhaustion. Physically, her time on the trail had left no lasting marks. The other rangers who'd escaped the trail's influence were a more complicated situation. 3 of them were recent enough disappearances that they could return to their lives with appropriate cover stories. But Morrison and the others from earlier decades had been declared dead long ago. Their families had grieved and moved on, and their reappearance would raise questions that no one was prepared to answer. In the end, the Park Service handled it the way large organizations always handle supernatural complications, by classifying everything above the security clearance of anyone who might ask inconvenient questions. Morrison and the other long-term missing rangers were quietly relocated to new lives with new identities, their rescue attributed to a classified military operation that had accidentally discovered them in a remote survival situation. I never told anyone about my expanded sensitivity to supernatural forces, but it didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger over the following months. I began to notice other anomalies in the park, places where reality felt thin, wildlife behavior that suggested the presence of things that shouldn't exist, and occasionally, signs that other supernatural traps were trying to establish themselves in Yellowstone's vast wilderness. But I was ready for them now. 3 months after the trail incident, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Thomas Morrison's handwriting. Chris, the trail was just one of many. Your gift makes you the guardian this place needs. Watch for the signs, trust your instincts, and remember that some searches are meant to save the searchers, not the lost. TM. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made all the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. Today, I'm still a ranger at Yellowstone, but I carry more than standard SAR equipment in my pack. I've learned to trust the supernatural sensitivity that the trail awakened in me, and I've used it to prevent 3 other incidents that could have trapped innocent people in situations similar to what Rachel experienced. I never found out what originally created the trail, or why it specifically targeted people involved in search and rescue operations. Some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate fully. But I did learn that the natural world has its own defenses against supernatural parasites, and sometimes those defenses just need someone with the right sensitivity to activate them. The guilt I carried about Tommy Morrison, no relation to the ranger Thomas Morrison, finally began to heal after saving Rachel. I realized that some tragedies are truly unavoidable, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to save people. It means we get better at recognizing when the rescue situation itself is the trap. Rachel Cooper recovered fully from her experience and returned to her life as a college student. She sent me a thank you card 6 months later, along with a photo of herself hiking in the Tetons. On the back, she'd written, "Some trails are worth following, and some rangers are worth following them with." I keep that photo on my desk at the Mammoth Station, right next to my radio and GPS unit. It reminds me that for every supernatural trap trying to exploit our desire to help others, there are 100 genuine situations where that same desire makes all the difference between life and death. And sometimes, when the autumn wind blows through the lodgepole pines just right, I can still feel the echo of that impossible trail calling to other searchers. But now I know how to answer. Not by walking away from the call to help others, but by being prepared for the searches that are something more than they appear. The wilderness is full of mysteries, and some of them are dangerous beyond imagination. But it's also full of people who need help, and that's a truth that no supernatural force can ever change. That's what I learned on the trail that shouldn't exist, and it's made me a better ranger than I ever was before. My name is Marcus Cole, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 14 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in October 2018, during what should have been a routine missing person search. But nothing about that day, or the 3 days that followed, was routine. The October rain had been relentless that week, turning the forest floor into a sponge that sucked at my Danner boots with every step. I'd been searching for Jennifer Rodriguez for 6 hours now, since her boyfriend called in a panic at 800 hours when she hadn't returned from her solo photography hike. My GPS unit showed I'd covered nearly 12 miles of the Hoh River Trail and its tributaries, following every possible route she might have taken. The metallic taste of exhaustion coated my tongue as I keyed my radio for the 15th time. Base, this is Ranger Cole. Grid reference 478021, 123.9344. Still no visual on the missing hiker. Over. Static crackled through my Motorola before dispatch responded. Copy, Marcus. Search and rescue team ETA 40 minutes to your position. Any new tracks? I stared down at the muddy ground where Jennifer's size 7 Merrill print simply ended. Not faded, not obscured by other tracks. They just stopped existing, as if she'd been plucked straight up into the canopy of ancient Sitka spruces towering above me. The wrongness of it made my shoulder muscles climb toward my ears, a reaction I'd learned to trust over the years. Negative on track space. Something's not. The words caught in my throat as a shadow moved wrong in my peripheral vision. Not moved exactly. Flowed. Like oil poured across the forest floor. I've seen things in these woods that don't belong in any ranger manual. 3 years ago, I watched something with too many teeth and not enough skin tear apart a campsite near Lake Quinault. The official report blamed a bear attack, but bears don't arrange human remains in geometric patterns. Bears don't carve symbols into Douglas fir bark that make your vision blur when you try to focus on them. That incident cost me my marriage, 2 months of sleep, and most people's respect at the ranger station. But it also taught me to pay attention when shadows behave like living things. Base, disregard last transmission, continuing search pattern Delta 7. I released the radio button and drew my Glock 22, though I knew bullets wouldn't help if I was right about what I was seeing. The shadow flowed again, this time clearly moving against the natural fall of afternoon light. It stretched from behind a moss-covered log toward a cluster of devil's club, and where it touched, the vibrant green of the understory plants began to wither. The smell hit me then, sweet decay mixed with something like burnt copper, strong enough to make my salivary glands contract painfully. I followed the shadow's path, my boots squelching through decomposing fern fronds that felt too warm under the cold October air. Every ranger instinct screamed at me to call for backup, to wait for search and rescue, to follow protocol. But Jennifer Rodriguez was 23 years old, a graduate student from Seattle who'd driven 4 hours to photograph old-growth forests for her thesis. Somewhere in this wilderness, she was counting on someone to find her. The shadow led me off trail, deeper into a section of forest I'd patrolled hundreds of times but had never really seen. The trees here grew differently, their trunks twisted in spirals that hurt to follow with your eyes, their branches interlaced in patterns that blocked out most of the sky. The sound of my own breathing became unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Then I found the first piece of evidence. Jennifer's Canon EOS camera hung from a low cedar branch, its black strap knotted around the wood with surgical precision. But the knot wasn't what made my vision narrow to a tunnel and my peripheral awareness disappear entirely. The camera's LCD screen was still active, cycling through the last photos she'd taken. The first few images showed normal forest scenes, light filtering through canopy, close-ups of moss patterns, the kind of nature photography that filled her Instagram account. But as I thumbed through the images, they became increasingly disturbing. Photos of trees that appeared to have faces carved into their bark, shots of what looked like ritualistic arrangements of animal bones. And then, in the final image, a figure standing among the trees. The figure was wrong in every way that mattered. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that suggested human origin but had been stretched and distorted beyond recognition. Its skin, if it was skin, appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. But the worst part was its shadow, which fell in every direction at once, creating a pool of absolute darkness at its feet. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. I was still staring at the image when I heard Jennifer scream. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the twisted forest, a raw, primal shriek that spoke of pain beyond anything a human throat should produce. I crashed through the undergrowth toward the sound, my radio bouncing against my hip as I ran, trying to raise dispatch between ragged breaths. Base. Medical emergency. Coordinates. Static overwhelmed my transmission, though my radio had been working perfectly moments before. The screen flickered and died, leaving me cut off from backup. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound I'd never heard before but recognized on some primitive level. The wet, tearing noise of something being fundamentally changed. I found her in a clearing I would have sworn didn't exist on any topographical map. Jennifer Rodriguez knelt in the center of a perfect circle of dead earth, her photography vest torn open, her skin taking on a grayish pallor that matched the withered vegetation around her. But she was alive, conscious, and looking directly at me with eyes that held too much knowledge. "You can see them too," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly across the 30 feet of dead ground between us. "The shadows. They've been waiting for someone like you." Jennifer, I'm Marcus Cole, Olympic National Park Ranger. I'm here to take you home. I kept my voice steady, professional, though every instinct told me to run. Can you walk? She laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a distant room. Walk? Marcus, I haven't been walking, I've been dancing. That's when I saw the figure from her photograph step out from behind a massive western hemlock. In person, it was worse than the image had suggested. Its elongated limbs moved with predatory grace, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Marcus Cole, it said, each syllable dripping with malicious amusement. The ranger who sees truth. We have been watching you since the Lake Quinault incident. You have potential. The thing that had been a woman once, centuries ago, before making choices that transformed her into something else entirely, stepped into the clearing. Her true form was a nightmare of stretched flesh and shadow, but I could see the intelligence in her ancient eyes. The local tribes had stories about her, Yindiye, the Shadow Walker, a medicine woman who had sought power beyond human understanding and found it. The girl is my latest acolyte, Yindiye continued, gesturing toward Jennifer with one impossibly long finger. But you, Marcus, you could be so much more. I can smell the gift on you, the ability to see beyond the veil. Jennifer's transformation was accelerating. Her fingernails had grown into black claws and shadows writhed beneath her skin like living tattoos. The wrongness of it made my stomach acid climb into my throat, burning and bitter. I feel it, Jennifer gasped, her voice becoming less human by the moment. The power. It's incredible, Marcus. You could have this too. For a moment, God help me, I was tempted. The constant questioning of my sanity, the isolation, the fear that came with seeing things others couldn't. It would all make sense if I accepted what I was being offered. But then I remembered why I became a ranger in the first place. My grandfather, who taught me to track, to read the forest's moods, to protect what couldn't protect itself. He'd told me stories about people who went into the woods and came back changed, warned me that some gifts came with prices too high to pay. I raised my Glock, though I knew conventional weapons were useless here. Let her go. Yindiye laughed, a sound like wind through bones. You cannot stop what has already begun. The girl came to me willingly, drawn by dreams I sent, just as you were drawn here. The shadow at her feet began to spread, reaching toward me with hungry tendrils. Where it touched my boots, I felt a cold that burned like frostbite. And suddenly I understood something that changed everything. I could feel the shadows, not just see them, feel them, like phantom limbs I'd never known I possessed. The realization hit me with the force of revelation. The Lake Quinault incident hadn't just traumatized me. It had awakened something dormant in my bloodline. Drawing on instincts I didn't know I possessed, I reached out with my mind and grasped the shadows that were reaching for me. The sensation was like grabbing live electrical wires, but I held on, bending them to my will instead of allowing them to consume me. Yindiye's confident expression shifted to surprise, then hunger. Yes, she hissed. You are exactly what I have been seeking. A natural shadow walker. Together we could reshape this entire forest. The battle that followed wasn't fought with bullets or physical force. It was a war of wills, fought in a realm where shadows had substance and darkness could cut deeper than any blade. I felt my consciousness expand beyond my body, grappling with something ancient and malevolent among the spaces between spaces. Jennifer's screams echoed through dimensions I couldn't name as I fought to sever the connections binding her to Yindiye's will. Each shadow I wrested away from the ancient witch felt like tearing away pieces of my own soul. But I pressed on, driven by the fundamental duty to protect and serve. The cost of victory became clear only as I felt Yindiye's hold on Jennifer breaking. To save her, I had to accept part of the curse into myself. The shadows that had been transforming her flowed into me instead, and I felt my own humanity fracturing under their weight. When the clearing finally fell silent, Jennifer lay unconscious but human, her skin returning to its natural color as the gray pallor faded. Yindiye was gone, banished but not destroyed. I could feel her presence retreating deeper into the forest, wounded but planning her return. I gathered Jennifer in my arms and began the long walk back to the trail, guided by GPS coordinates that somehow appeared correctly on my miraculously functioning radio. But with each step, I felt the shadows I'd absorbed growing stronger, more demanding. They whispered of power and transformation, of the freedom that came with abandoning human limitations. Search and rescue found us just as darkness fell. Jennifer responsive but claiming no memory of her missing 3 days. The medical team attributed her condition to exposure and dehydration, and she recovered fully within a week. She never spoke of what happened in that clearing, though sometimes I catch her watching shadows with a wariness that suggests she remembers more than she admits. I returned to duty, filed my report as a successful rescue with no additional details, and tried to resume normal life. But normal life isn't possible when you can feel every shadow in the forest calling your name. The gift or curse I'd awakened grew stronger with each passing day, allowing me to see deeper into the hidden world that exists parallel to our own. 6 months later, I resigned from the National Park Service. The official reason was early retirement due to stress, but the truth was simpler. I could no longer trust myself around the people I'd sworn to protect. The shadows whisper constantly now, offering power in exchange for surrender, promising that the hunger growing inside me will eventually become unbearable. I saved Jennifer Rodriguez, and I'd make the same choice again. But some victories demand payments that continue long after the battle ends. I can feel Yindia out there, patient and eternal, waiting for the day when the shadows I carry finally claim what's left of my humanity. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. The only question now is whether I'll find a way to break free from this curse before it consumes me completely, or whether the next ranger to encounter something impossible in these woods will find me standing among the shadows, offering the same terrible choice I once faced. Some gifts, my grandfather used to say, are really just curses wearing friendly masks. I understand now what he meant, and why he always looked so sad when he told those old stories about the things that lived between the trees. The forest remembers everything, and some memories have teeth. My name is Ryan Blackwood, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 18 years. In all that time, I've pulled lost hikers from ravines, tracked poachers through miles of dense undergrowth, and faced down aggressive black bears with nothing but a radio and my wits. I thought I'd seen everything these ancient forests could throw at me. I was wrong. This happened in October 2018, during what should have been a routine missing person case. Taylor Anderson, a 23-year-old theater student from Seattle, had vanished 3 days earlier while hiking the Hoh River Trail. Her roommate reported her missing when Taylor failed to return from what was supposed to be a day hike. Standard protocol. We organized search teams, deployed K-9 units, and I coordinated the effort from our command post at the Salt Duke Ranger Station. The impossible evidence showed up on day 2. Officer Martinez from the Clallam County Sheriff's Department called me at 0630 hours, his voice tight with confusion. "Blackwood, you need to see this. We found something that doesn't make sense." I drove my patrol truck down Highway 101. The October fog so thick my headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead. The metallic taste of coffee mixed with the pine-scented air filtering through my vents. My radio crackled with morning check-ins from other rangers, their voices a familiar comfort in the gray dawn. Martinez met me at the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center parking lot, holding an evidence bag. Inside was Taylor Anderson's student ID card, completely dry, despite 3 days of heavy Pacific Northwest rain. "Where did you find this?" I asked, pulling on latex gloves to examine the bag more closely. "That's the problem." Martinez pointed toward the visitor center building. "Maintenance found it this morning, inside the locked building on the front desk." My jaw muscles tensed as I processed this information. The visitor center had been closed since Sunday, 2 days before Taylor went missing. The building was secured with electronic locks, motion sensors, and a security system that logged every entry. No alarms had been triggered. Security footage? That's the other problem. The cameras show nothing. But here's what really doesn't add up. The card wasn't there yesterday. Jerry, the maintenance supervisor, swears the desk was clear when he left Tuesday evening. I held the evidence bag up to catch the morning light filtering through the fog. The ID showed Taylor's photo, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes smiling at the camera. But something about the image seemed off, though I couldn't quite identify what. "I need to see the exact location," I said. Inside the visitor center, the morning air carried the musty scent of closed buildings and old wood. My footsteps echoed hollow against the tile floor as Martinez led me to the front desk. The familiar smell of pine sol mixed with something else, something that made my sinuses tighten and my breathing shallow. "Right here," Martinez said, pointing to the center of the wooden desk surface. Placed like someone had carefully set it down, I knelt to examine the desk more closely, pulling out my LED flashlight. No dust patterns, no fingerprints visible to the naked eye. But there was something else. A faint outline in the wood grain, as if the ID had been sitting there much longer than overnight. The wood showed a slight discoloration, like a photograph left in sunlight. My peripheral vision caught movement, just a flicker at the edge of my sight. I turned, but the visitor center was empty, except for Martinez and me. The sensation lingered, though, like being watched from just outside my field of vision. "Has anyone else handled this?" I asked, standing and brushing dust from my knees. "Just Jerry when he found it, then me. Crime scene techs are on their way, but I wanted you to see it first." I radioed my supervisor, Lieutenant Collins, and updated him on the situation. The evidence suggested either an elaborate prank or something far more concerning. Given Taylor's 3-day absence and the impossibility of the ID's placement, we had to assume the worst. "Expand the search perimeter," Collins instructed through the radio static. "Focus on the areas between Hoh River Trail and Hurricane Ridge. Someone's playing games or we're missing something important." The next 6 hours blurred together in a methodical search pattern. I led a team of 4 volunteers through the dense Olympic Peninsula forest, following GPS coordinates and marking our progress on topographical maps. The October air hung heavy with moisture, making every breath feel thick and substantial. Douglas fir and western hemlock towered above us, their branches creating a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. My radio buzzed with periodic updates from other search teams. Nothing. No torn clothing, no footprints, no broken branches indicating someone had passed through recently. Taylor Anderson had seemingly vanished without leaving a trace. At 14:30 hours, we stopped for a brief rest near a cluster of old-growth cedars. I was checking our GPS coordinates when volunteer searcher Mike Henderson called out from 30 yards northeast of our position. "Blackwood, you need to see this." I jogged through the undergrowth, my heavy boots sinking slightly into the spongy forest floor. Henderson stood beside what appeared to be a small wooden structure, partially hidden by decades of moss and fern growth. It was a stage, not a natural rock formation or fallen logs arranged by chance, but an actual wooden platform about 10 feet square, complete with what remained of a proscenium arch. The wood was old but remarkably well preserved, as if the forest had been protecting it rather than reclaiming it. "I've been hiking this area for 15 years, Henderson said, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard from him before. "This has never been here." I approached the structure carefully, noting how my footsteps seemed to echo despite being an open forest. The stage was elevated about 3 feet off the ground, with what looked like trapdoors built into the platform. Carved into the front beam, barely visible beneath the moss, were words in an ornate script. "The Eternal Theater Company, Esther 1952. My fingers went numb as I traced the carved letters. The wood felt warm despite the cool October air, and I could swear I felt a faint vibration like machinery running deep underground. "Henderson, radio the other teams. Tell them we found a structure that might be related to the missing person case." As Henderson moved away to make the radio call, I climbed onto the stage platform. The wood was solid beneath my boots, but my vision seemed to tunnel, as if the forest around the stage was darkening at the edges. The familiar sounds of the Olympic Peninsula forest, bird calls, wind through branches, the distant sound of running water, faded to an unnatural silence. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, like wind through distant trees but growing clearer. The sound of applause, My shoulders climbed toward my ears as every instinct screamed danger. The applause wasn't coming from any direction I could identify. It seemed to emanate from the stage itself, from below the wooden platform. I tried to step backward off the stage, but my legs wouldn't respond to my commands. My breathing became rapid and shallow, each breath feeling insufficient. The applause grew louder, and underneath it, I could hear voices. Not just voices, a conversation, as clear as if people were standing right beside me. "She's perfect for Ophelia," a woman's voice said. "Young, tragic, beautiful. The audience will weep. But will she stay for the full performance?" This voice was male, older, with the trained projection of a career actor. The last one tried to leave during the second act. "This one understands commitment," the woman replied. "I can see it in her eyes. She won't disappoint us." The voices were discussing Taylor Anderson. I was certain of it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my radio. Static filled the channel when I tried to call Henderson. Not the normal static of radio interference, but something that sounded almost like whispered words. I forced my legs to move, stepping toward the edge of the stage platform. But as my boot reached the edge, the forest around me shifted. The Douglas firs and cedars that had surrounded the stage moments before were gone, replaced by ornate red curtains that stretched up into darkness. Gas lamps flickered along what appeared to be the walls of a theater, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their light sources. The smell hit me then, grease paint and old velvet, mixed with something underlying that made my stomach clench. Not decay exactly, but the scent of something that had been preserved far beyond its natural time. "Welcome to the Eternal Theater," the male voice said, now coming from directly behind me. I spun around to find myself facing a tall man in a Victorian-era suit, his face pale and gaunt, with eyes that held no warmth. Beside him stood a woman in an elaborate gown, her beauty marred by the same cold emptiness in her gaze. "We've been waiting for you, Ranger Blackwood," the woman said, "though you're not quite right for our current production. Too strong, too grounded in the mundane world, but perhaps—" She circled me slowly, and I felt my peripheral vision disappearing, as if I was looking at the world through a narrow tube. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that Victorian actors couldn't be standing in an Olympic National Park forest, that theaters didn't materialize around isolated stages. But a deeper part of me, a part I'd never acknowledged before, recognized something familiar in their presence. Something that explained the déjà vu I'd experienced countless times in these forests, the sensation of being watched, the dreams of places I'd never seen but somehow knew. "Where is Taylor Anderson?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Miss Anderson is currently rehearsing," the male actor replied. "She's proven quite talented, though she lacks commitment to the role. She keeps trying to improvise." The woman laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "She doesn't understand that some performances never end, that some theaters exist outside the boundaries of time and mortality." I tried to reach for my radio again, but my arm moved as if through thick water. The woman noticed my struggle and smiled. "Modern technology has no power here, Ranger Blackwood. We exist in the spaces between what your world considers real. We are the performance that continues after the curtain falls, the story that refuses to end." The stage beneath my feet began to vibrate, and I heard the mechanical grinding of hidden machinery. Trapdoors in the platform started to open, revealing not the forest floor below, but darkness that seemed to extend infinitely downward. "Our current production requires a male lead," the male actor continued. "Someone strong, someone who won't abandon the performance when it becomes challenging. You have the look of someone who finishes what he starts. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories." The trapdoor directly beneath my feet began to open wider. I could hear Taylor's voice now, distant but clear, speaking lines from what sounded like Hamlet, but her voice carried a note of desperation, as if she was screaming for help through the medium of Shakespeare. That's when something inside me shifted. A sensation I'd never experienced before, like static electricity building in my bones, The feeling started in my chest and spread outward, until my fingertips tingled with an energy that felt both foreign and completely natural. The Victorian actors stepped back, their confident expressions flickering with what might have been surprise. "Interesting," the woman murmured. "You're not quite as mundane as we assumed." I focused on that strange energy, not understanding what it was but instinctively knowing how to use it. The sensation intensified, and suddenly I could see the theater around me for what it really was. Not a solid structure, but a projection. A performance itself designed to trap and confuse. The gas lamps weren't gas lamps at all, but some kind of bioluminescent fungus that had been cultivated to mimic artificial light. The red curtains were massive spider webs, dyed crimson and woven into elaborate patterns. The Victorian actors were something else entirely, wearing the appearance of humans like actors wearing masks. But beneath the illusion, I could sense the real structure. A complex of underground chambers built into the root system of the ancient trees, connected by tunnels that had been carved decades ago. And somewhere in that network, Taylor Anderson was trapped, performing against her will for an audience that existed between the world of the living and something else entirely. "Let her go," I said, and my voice carried a resonance that seemed to make the false theater shimmer at the edges. The male actor's disguise slipped for just a moment, revealing something ancient and desperate underneath. "She belongs to the performance now, as will you. The Eternal Theater Company has been presenting uninterrupted productions since 1952. We cannot simply let our actors leave." I took a step forward, the strange energy building inside me like pressure in a closed system. The wooden stage beneath my feet began to crack, and I realized that whatever power was awakening in me was affecting the physical world around us. 70 years, I said, pieces of understanding clicking into place. "You've been taking people for 70 years. Hikers, campers, anyone who wandered too close to your theater." The woman's beautiful mask slipped entirely, revealing something that might have once been human but had been warped by decades of existing in the spaces between reality and performance. "We are artists, Ranger Blackwood. We serve something greater than mere mortal existence. We serve the eternal story, the performance that transcends death itself." I felt the energy inside me reach a critical point, and suddenly I could sense every living thing in the forest around us. Not just the trees and animals, but the network of mycorrhizal fungi that connected the root systems, the vast underground web of life that had existed here for millennia. And I could feel how the theater had tapped into that network, using it like a parasitic organism feeding on the life force of the forest itself. But I could also feel Taylor, somewhere beneath us in the underground chambers. She was weak but alive, and she was fighting every moment to maintain her sense of self against whatever force was trying to make her into a permanent member of their cast. The trapdoor beneath my feet opened completely, but instead of falling, I found myself suspended by the same energy that was crackling through my nervous system. I looked down into the darkness and called out with both my voice and something deeper. "Taylor, can you hear me?" Her response came not through sound, but through the same energy network I'd tapped into. Fear, relief, desperate hope, and underneath it all, a fierce determination not to give up. The Victorian actors moved toward me simultaneously, their human disguises now completely abandoned. I could see them clearly now. Beings that had once been human, transformed by their obsession with performance into something that could only exist by feeding on the life force and identity of others. But the energy coursing through me wasn't just defensive. I could feel it connecting me to something vast and protective. The accumulated strength of every ranger who had ever walked these trails, every person who had loved and protected these forests. I wasn't facing this alone. I directed that energy downward, through the network of roots and fungi, straight to where Taylor was trapped. I felt her gasp as the power reached her, restoring her strength and breaking whatever hold the theater had established over her mind. The entire structure began to shake. The false theater dissolved like smoke, revealing the actual wooden stage in the forest clearing. But now I could see the concealed entrance built into the stage platform, and the system of tunnels that extended deep into the forest floor. The beings that had appeared as Victorian actors recoiled from the energy I was projecting, their forms becoming increasingly unstable. "You don't understand what you're destroying," the male creature hissed. "We are preserving art, preserving performance beyond the limitations of mortal existence." "You're parasites," I replied, feeling the truth of it resonate through the energy network. "You've been feeding on people's identities, their life force, their freedom to choose their own stories." I focused all the power I could gather and sent it flooding through the underground tunnel system. I felt Taylor break free from whatever chamber had been holding her, felt her climbing upward through passages that led back to the concealed entrance in the stage platform. The wooden stage cracked and splintered as the tunnel system collapsed. The two creatures let out sounds that might have been screams, or might have been the death cries of something that should never have existed in the first place. They faded like shadows when a bright light is turned on, leaving only the scent of old grease paint and the fading echo of applause. Taylor Anderson emerged from a hidden panel in the stage platform, blinking in the filtered forest light. She was dirty and exhausted, but alive in herself. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made my knees weak. "Ranger Blackwood?" she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "How did you... What was that place?" I helped her down from the crumbling stage, noting that my hands were still tingling with residual energy. "I'm not entirely sure. How long do you think you were down there?" "Hours, maybe days. It was hard to tell. They kept making me rehearse scenes over and over. Every time I tried to refuse or tried to leave, the words would just come out of my mouth anyway, like they were controlling what I said. I radioed for medical support in our location, but my mind was reeling with questions I couldn't answer. The energy that had awakened in me was still there, quieter now but unmistakably present. I could sense the life of the forest around us with a clarity I'd never experienced before. When the medical team arrived 30 minutes later, Taylor was coherent and mostly unharmed, though she showed signs of dehydration and exhaustion. As they prepared to transport her to Olympic Medical Center for evaluation, she grabbed my arm. "The man and woman who held me captive," she said quietly. "They kept talking about other people, other performers over the years. There are belongings down in those tunnels, Ranger Blackwood, personal items from dozens of people." I nodded, understanding what she was telling me. The Eternal Theater Company had been operating for 70 years, and Taylor had been lucky to escape. Others might not have been so fortunate. Over the following weeks, we conducted the most extensive investigation in Olympic National Park history. Crime scene techs excavated the collapsed tunnel system and found evidence of at least 37 people who had vanished in the area since 1952. Personal belongings, identification, and in some cases, human remains that had been preserved in the underground chambers. The official report attributed the disappearances to a hermit who had been living in an elaborate underground shelter and had been mentally unstable. It was a neat explanation that satisfied the press and the families who finally got answers about their missing loved ones. But I knew the truth was more complex than that. The energy that had awakened in me during the confrontation never fully went away. I could sense things in the forest that I'd never noticed before: the health of individual trees, the movement of animals before I could see or hear them, the subtle wrongness of places where the natural balance had been disturbed. I learned to use these abilities carefully, never mentioning them in my reports but allowing them to guide me toward hikers in trouble, toward poachers operating illegally, toward environmental hazards before they became serious problems. My success rate as a ranger improved dramatically, and my colleagues started joking that I had a sixth sense about the forest. They weren't wrong. 6 months after the incident, I was promoted to lead ranger for the Western District of Olympic National Park. Lieutenant Collins said my handling of the Taylor Anderson case demonstrated exceptional skill and dedication. If he noticed that I seemed to know things I shouldn't be able to know, he never mentioned it. Taylor recovered completely from her experience, though she changed her major from theater to environmental science. She stayed in touch, visiting the park twice a year and always stopping by the ranger station to say hello. She never talked about what had happened to her in the underground chambers, but I could see in her eyes that she remembered everything. On her last visit, in September 2019, she brought me a gift, a small carved wooden token in the shape of a tree. "I made this in my woodworking class," she said. "I wanted you to have it as a thank you. Not just for rescuing me, but for... I don't know how to explain it. for becoming something more than you were before. I could feel it when you found me down there. You changed yourself to save me. I kept the carved tree on my desk at the ranger station, and sometimes when I held it, I could feel the same energy that had awakened in me that day in the forest. It was a reminder that the wilderness held mysteries far deeper than most people suspected, and that sometimes, when we're pushed to our limits, we discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. The wooden stage disappeared completely during the winter storms of 2018-2019. When the snow melted in spring, there was no trace that it had ever existed, just a small clearing where the forest was already beginning to reclaim the ground. But sometimes, late at night when I'm doing paperwork at the ranger station, I can still hear the faint sound of applause carried on the wind. Not threatening now, just appreciative, as if something out there approves of the performance I gave when it mattered most. I've been a forest ranger for 20 years now, and I've learned that protecting the wilderness means more than just enforcing regulations and rescuing lost hikers. Sometimes it means standing guard against things that exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to believe. The forests of the Olympic Peninsula are vast and ancient, full of wonders and terrors that most people will never encounter. But they're also full of a power that responds to genuine love and protection, a force that will awaken extraordinary capabilities in those who prove themselves worthy guardians. I am no longer just Ryan Blackwood, Forest Ranger. I am Ryan Blackwood, keeper of the deeper mysteries, protector of both the seen and unseen wilderness, and I have never been more proud of who I've become. That's my story, and I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. My name is Robert Carter, and I've been a forest ranger at Yosemite National Park for 12 years. I've always prided myself on being a man of science, someone who could explain away every strange sound, every odd shadow, every paranormal experience with cold, hard facts. Temperature variations cause wood to crack at night. Wind patterns create unusual sounds through rock formations. Pareidolia makes us see faces in trees and shadows. That was before October 15, 2016, before Rachel Garcia. Before I learned that some things can't be explained away with logic and reason. It was 2:47 p.m. when I realized I'd been searching for Rachel for nearly 6 hours, and my radio crackled with nothing but static. The taste of morning coffee had long since turned bitter and metallic in my mouth, and my uniform, regulation green wool shirt, tactical pants, and 200-gram Danner boots, felt heavy with accumulated sweat despite the crisp autumn air. My shoulders had climbed so high with tension they practically touched my earlobes. Rachel Garcia, 23 years old, had gone missing somewhere along the Pine Creek Trail at approximately 8:30 a.m. Last seen by her hiking partner near coordinates 37.7459 N, 119.5332W, wearing a red North Face jacket that should have made her visible from half a mile away in this terrain. Her partner, Marcus, had stepped away for less than 10 minutes to relieve himself behind a boulder cluster. When he returned, Rachel was gone. Standard protocol. I'd followed every step, established a hasty team, coordinated with dispatch via radio code 10 to 20 for location updates, deployed tracking resources. My Garmin eTrex GPS unit showed I'd covered 4.2 miles of increasingly difficult terrain. The autumn air carried the smell of decomposing oak leaves and wet granite, punctuated by the sharp scent of Jeffrey pine sap. But something was wrong. Fundamentally, mathematically wrong. I stopped at a flat granite outcrop and pulled out my field notebook, checking my coordinates against the search grid. According to my calculations, I should have intersected the Pine Creek Trail 47 minutes ago. Instead, the landscape around me looked unfamiliar. Dense clusters of lodgepole pine that shouldn't exist at this elevation. Strange rock formations that didn't match the geological surveys I'd memorized. That's when I heard the laughter. High-pitched, musical, definitely human. Children's laughter echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest. My peripheral vision seemed to tunnel, creating a strange telescoping effect as I tried to locate the source. The sound bounced off the granite walls in impossible ways, coming from ahead of me, then behind, then above. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Rachel? Is someone there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the distant call of a Stellar's jay and the whisper of wind through pine needles. I checked my radio, still static. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this terrain, but the complete radio silence was troubling. I followed the direction where the laughter had seemed strongest, pushing through a thick stand of manzanita bushes. The thorny branches caught on my equipment belt, home to my Streamlight flashlight, multi-tool, first aid kit, and emergency whistle. Each step forward felt like wading through increasingly thick air. 20 yards into the thicket, I found the first sign. A small sneaker, child-sized maybe for a 7 or 8-year-old, hanging from a branch at exactly eye level. The shoe was pristine white leather with purple Velcro straps, but what made my fingers go numb was that it was still warm to the touch, and tied to the laces was a note written in crayon. "Rachel went to play with us. Follow the yellow flowers." I dropped the shoe immediately, my hands refusing to obey basic motor commands. Around the base of the tree, I noticed a scattered trail of what looked like marigold petals, bright yellow against the brown forest floor. But marigolds don't grow wild in Yosemite, especially not at this elevation, and definitely not in October. My training kicked in. Document everything. I pulled out my digital camera, a Canon PowerShot that could timestamp and GPS tag each photo. As I raised it to photograph the shoe, the LCD screen showed nothing but pixelated static. I tried several more shots, but each image came out corrupted, filled with what looked like dark, reaching shapes that hadn't been visible to my naked eye. The laughter started again, closer this time, and I could make out individual voices. At least 3 children, maybe 4, giggling and whispering in what sounded like a sing-song chant. Come play, Rachel wants to play." Against every protocol I'd ever learned, I followed the trail of yellow petals. The flowers led me deeper into terrain that my rational mind insisted couldn't exist. The forest grew denser and darker despite it being mid-afternoon. The canopy above formed an almost complete seal, allowing only scattered beams of greenish light to filter through. The air tasted of copper and something else, something organic and wrong that made my tongue feel thick and unresponsive. After what felt like an hour but could only have been minutes, I emerged into a circular clearing that made my vision swim with vertigo. In the center stood 5 children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, all holding hands in a circle around what appeared to be Rachel Garcia. She was alive, but something was horribly wrong. Rachel stood perfectly still in the center of the circle, her red North Face jacket now torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Her eyes were open but completely white. No iris, no pupil, just blank white orbs that seemed to track my movement. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, and from it poured a steady stream of the same yellow flower petals that had led me here. The children surrounding her looked normal at first glance, worn hiking clothes, muddy sneakers, backpacks. But as I watched, I realized their feet weren't quite touching the ground. They hovered maybe an inch above the earth, and when they turned to look at me in perfect unison, I saw that their eyes were the same blank white as Rachel's. "Ranger Carter," they said in perfect synchronization, their voices a harmony of innocence corrupted. "We've been waiting for you." The child closest to me, a boy of maybe 8 with sandy hair and a dinosaur t-shirt, smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Rachel is almost ready to join us permanently, but we need one more for the circle." That's when the impossible happened. Without any conscious decision, I felt something inside my mind expand, like a muscle I'd never known I had suddenly flexing. The sensation started as pressure behind my eyes and spread downward through my entire body, making my fingertips tingle with what felt like electricity. Suddenly, I could see them, not the children they appeared to be, but what they really were underneath. Twisted, elongated forms with skin like bark and fingers that ended in root-like tendrils. Their true mouths were vertical slits that ran from their foreheads to their chins, lined with rows of thorns instead of teeth. They weren't children at all. They were something that had been wearing the appearance of children like masks. The boy thing closest to me tilted its head, and its fake human face flickered like a bad television signal. "Oh," it said, its voice now carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. "You can see us now. How interesting. It's been so long since we've had a sensitive." What happened next I can't fully explain with any scientific methodology I know. The electricity I'd felt building in my fingertips suddenly discharged outward in a wave of visible energy. The air around me shimmered like heat mirages, and everywhere the wave touched, the false children stumbled backward, their disguises failing completely. They were horrific to behold in their true forms, roughly humanoid but stretched and wrong, like trees that had learned to walk upright. Their skin wasn't skin at all but bark and moss and decay. Instead of eyes, they had hollow sockets filled with writhing insects. When they opened their mouths to scream, beetles and centipedes poured out along with sounds no human throat could make. But I wasn't done. The energy kept building, and with it came knowledge I had never learned. I understood, suddenly and completely, that these things had been feeding on missing hikers for decades. Children were their preferred prey, easier to lure, easier to convert. Rachel wasn't the first, and if I failed here, she wouldn't be the last. I raised my hands and the energy focused into something like lightning. When it struck the creature circle, the false children shrieked in harmonies that made reality blur at the edges. One by one, they began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart into scattered leaves and rotting wood. But their destruction came at a cost I hadn't anticipated. As each creature fell, I felt pieces of myself tearing away. Memories, emotions, fragments of my identity got caught in the energy discharge and scattered to the wind like ashes. By the time the last creature collapsed into a pile of mulch and bone, I could no longer remember my mother's maiden name, or the feeling of my first kiss, or the sound of my daughter's laughter. Rachel collapsed as soon as the circle broke, the yellow petals finally stopping their flow from her mouth. I stumbled over to her, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She was breathing, but when she opened her eyes, they were still that horrible blank white. The walk back to civilization took 4 hours, though my GPS insisted we had only traveled 1.3 miles from the original trail. Rachel walked beside me in complete silence, her white eyes staring at things I couldn't see. When we finally reached the ranger station, she blinked once, and her normal brown eyes returned. She remembered nothing of her experience. As far as she knew, she had simply gotten lost and I had found her. The medical examination revealed no physical trauma, no evidence of what she had endured. But I remember everything. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep searching or turn back? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories. The official report listed Rachel Garcia's disappearance as a case of a hiker who had become disoriented and lost, then found by search and rescue within standard parameters. No mention of missing children, no mention of creatures, no mention of the abilities I discovered I possessed. I still work as a ranger at Yosemite, but everything has changed. The energy I tapped into that day didn't disappear. It's still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Sometimes I catch glimpses of things that others can't see. Shadows that move wrong, sounds that have no source, flowers that grow where they shouldn't. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still hear children's laughter echoing from the deep forest. The missing person reports from the past 50 years make for interesting reading if you know what to look for. 7 children vanished without a trace in the Pine Creek area. Their cases were never closed, their bodies never found. I know where they went. I know what they became. And I know that what I destroyed that day was just one circle, in one clearing, in one small section of forest. There are others. Rachel Garcia went back to her normal life, but she sends me a card every year on October 15th. She never writes anything except, "Thank you." But sometimes I find yellow flower petals pressed between the pages. I saved her, but the cost was higher than I initially realized. The memories I lost weren't random. They were specifically the ones that connected me most deeply to my own humanity. My capacity for joy diminished. My ability to form deep emotional connections became limited. I gained the power to see and fight the supernatural, but I lost essential pieces of what made me human. The Forest Service has assigned me permanently to the Pine Creek sector. Officially, It's because of my excellent track record in search and rescue. Unofficially, I think some people in the higher levels of park administration know more than they let on. They need someone who can handle the unusual cases. So that's my story. And I'm still not sure I made the right choices. What do you think? Would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from the forest. I patrol these woods now with a different understanding of what lurks in the shadows between the trees. And when hikers go missing in ways that don't make sense, when the search patterns lead to impossible places, when children's laughter echoes from empty forest, I know what to do, even if it costs me more pieces of myself each time. My name is Marcus Stone, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in October 2015, during what should have been a routine missing person search. But there's nothing routine about what lives in the deepest parts of these ancient forests. And there's sure as hell nothing routine about losing everything you love to save someone else. The radio crackled through the early morning mist as I adjusted my GPS unit for the 100th time in the past 6 hours. Base, this is Ranger Stone. Still no sign of Ashley Morgan at grid reference 47-5742N, 123-3015W. Moving to Sector 7. Copy that, Stone. Any tracks? I pressed my thumb against the radio button, feeling the familiar weight of my service pistol against my hip and the 40-pound pack cutting into my shoulders. The October air carried the scent of rotting cedar and something else, something metallic that made my throat close up. Negative on tracks. Trail goes cold at Marymere Falls. It's like she just vanished. That wasn't entirely true. There were tracks, but they weren't human. Not anymore. The search had started at 200 hours when Ashley's camping group reported her missing from their site near Lake Crescent. 22 years old, experienced hiker, carried proper gear. The kind who doesn't just wander off and disappear. But I'd learned in my years out here that the forest doesn't care about experience or preparation. It takes what it wants. My phone buzzed against my chest pocket. Sarah's ringtone. I almost didn't answer. Couldn't handle another fight about my priorities while I was trying to save someone's daughter. But the family crisis at home had been building for months, and ignoring it wasn't making it go away. Marcus, where are you? Sarah's voice was tight with exhaustion. Emma's temperature spiked to 104. The doctors want to run more tests. My 6-year-old daughter had been sick for weeks with something the doctors couldn't identify. Sarah blamed my long hours in the forest, said I was never there when they needed me. Maybe she was right. I'm in the middle of a search and rescue, Sarah. There's a girl missing. There's always a girl missing, Marcus. Always someone else's emergency while your own family falls apart. The line went dead. I stared at the phone's blank screen, my peripheral vision tunneling until the forest around me felt like looking through a cardboard tube. My fingers had gone numb in the cold, refusing to obey when I tried to pocket the device. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, hand moving instinctively to my sidearm. The forest was silent except for the distant call of a Steller's jay and the soft drip of condensation from Douglas fir needles. But there was something wrong with the silence. It was too complete, like every living thing within a mile radius had suddenly decided to hold its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the moss-covered trees. "Ashley, if you can hear me, I'm here to help." Nothing. I keyed my radio again. "Base, I'm picking up some unusual wildlife behavior in Sector 7. All bird calls have stopped. Requesting backup for search pattern." "Stone, you're breaking up. Say again." I looked at my radio display. Full signal strength, but static filled the channel like white noise. My GPS unit flickered, the coordinates scrambling into meaningless numbers before going dark entirely. The metallic smell was stronger now, mixed with something sweet and rotten that made my stomach lurch. I'd smelled decomposition before. Deer hit by cars, hikers who'd fallen from cliffs, but this was different. This was decomposition mixed with something alive and hungry. Flashback. 3 months earlier. "Tell me about the old stories, Marcus." That's what Bill Clearwater had said during our monthly tribal liaison meeting. Bill was Quinault, Born and raised on the reservation that bordered the park's southern edge, his grandfather had been a tribal ranger before the National Park Service took over, and Bill knew these forests in ways that couldn't be taught in any training manual. "What kind of old stories?" I'd asked, pouring coffee from the thermos Sarah had packed that morning. Back when she still did things like that. Back when Emma's laughter filled our house instead of coughing fits that kept us all awake. "The kind about things that hunt people," Bill had said, his weathered face serious. "My grandfather told me about something that came through these woods in 1943. During the war years when people were desperate, hungry. Desperation can change a man, Marcus. Change him into something that's not a man anymore." I'd laughed it off then. Bill was full of stories, some true, some legend, most somewhere in between, but he'd grabbed my arm as I stood to leave. "If you ever find tracks that start human and become something else, you radio for help and you get out. You understand me? These trees have been here for 1,000 years. They've seen things that don't belong in any ranger manual." Present. The tracks I was following now had started human. Size 7 hiking boot. Distinctive tread pattern that matched Ashley Morgan's gear description. But 20 yards back, the left foot had begun to change. The boot print elongated, deepened. Claw marks appeared at the front of each impression, gouging into the soft earth like talons. By the time I reached the creek bed, the tracks were no longer human at all. I knelt beside the water, my knees sinking into mud that felt too warm for October. The prints here were massive, easily 18 inches long, with 4 distinct claw marks that had carved through roots and rocks like they were tissue paper. But it was the spacing between them that made my shoulders rise until they nearly touched my ears. Whatever was making these tracks could cover 20 feet in a single stride. My radio hissed to life with a burst of static, then cleared just enough for me to make out a voice. But it wasn't bass. It was high, feminine, terrified. "Help. Please help me. I can't. Oh God, what's happening to me? Ashley?" I pressed the radio so hard against my mouth I could taste copper. "Ashley Morgan, is that you? What's your location?" The static returned, then her voice again, but wrong somehow, deeper than before, with an edge that made the hair on my forearms stand straight up. "So, hungry? Marcus, it hurts so much." She knew my name. She knew my fucking name. I fumbled for my GPS backup unit, hands shaking as I tried to get a triangulation on the signal, but the device showed nothing. No coordinates, no signal source, just static that rose and fell like breathing. "Ashley, I need you to stay calm and tell me where you are. Can you see any landmarks? Any distinctive trees or rock formations?" When her voice came back, it was barely recognizable as human. The old cedar with the door. The old cedar with the door. Every ranger knew that tree. A massive western red cedar about 3 miles deeper into the forest with a hollow at its base big enough for a person to crawl through. Hikers called it the door tree and took pictures there constantly. But nobody went there alone. Not if they had any sense. My phone buzzed again. A text from Sarah. "Emma's asking for you. She's scared." I stared at the message, my vision blurring at the edges. 22-year-old Ashley Morgan was somewhere in these woods, hurt and alone, and calling for help. But my 6-year-old daughter was in a hospital bed, fever burning through her small body, asking for her daddy, who was once again choosing strangers over family. The choice should have been simple. Should have been. Base. This is Ranger Stone. I'm tracking possible survivor contact toward the old growth cedar in Sector 9. ETA 30 minutes. Stone, you're breaking protocol. Wait for backup. I was already moving, following the impossible tracks deeper into the forest, where the canopy blocked out all but thin threads of afternoon light. Behind me, my phone buzzed with increasingly desperate texts from Sarah that I couldn't bring myself to read. The tracks led up a steep ravine where ancient trees grew so close together, I had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. The air here was different, thicker, harder to breathe, like the forest itself was pressing down on my lungs. Twice I stopped to rest, my throat raw and my vision swimming. only to realize I could taste something metallic coating my tongue. When I finally reached the old cedar, I understood why the tribal stories had warned people away from this place. The tree was massive, easily 12 feet in diameter, with bark so thick and furrowed it looked like carved stone. But the door at its base wasn't the innocent hollow I remembered from training exercises. Someone, or something, had been digging it out from the inside. Fresh earth was piled around the entrance, mixed with what looked like fragments of clothing and something else I didn't want to examine too closely. "Ashley?" I called softly, unholstering my pistol. "Are you in there?" A sound came from inside the hollow, not quite human, not quite animal. Something between a moan and a growl that made every muscle in my body lock up with instinctive terror. "Marcus?" The voice was Ashley's, but stretched and distorted like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam trembling as I aimed it into the darkness beneath the tree. Ashley Morgan was there, curled against the back wall of the hollow in a position that would have been impossible for any human spine to achieve. Her hiking clothes hung in tatters from a frame that seemed to have stretched and elongated, and when she turned toward my light, her face was a nightmare of transformation, caught halfway between human and something else entirely. Her jaw had distended, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Her fingers had become claws that dug constantly into her own flesh, leaving gouges that bled black in the flashlight beam. But her eyes were still human, still Ashley, still aware enough to be terrified of what she was becoming. "Kill me," she whispered through the ruined remains of her mouth. "Please, before it's complete." Flashback. 1 month earlier. "Daddy, what happens when people get lost in the forest?" Emma had asked that during one of my rare evenings home, curled against my side on the couch while Sarah did dishes in the kitchen with the kind of aggressive clattering that meant she was angry about something. Probably the overtime I'd been pulling, probably the fact that I'd missed another parent-teacher conference, probably everything. "Well, sweetheart, that's why they have rangers like Daddy. We go find them and bring them home safe." "But what if the forest doesn't want to give them back?" I'd looked down at my daughter's serious little face, her fever-bright eyes reflecting the glow from the television. Even then, weeks before she got really sick, something had been wrong. Something that made her ask questions that 6-year-olds shouldn't think to ask. "The forest isn't alive, Emma. It can't want anything." "Are you sure, Daddy? Because sometimes I dream about trees that are hungry." Present Ashley's transformation accelerated as I watched, her spine cracking and reforming, lengthening, as her ribcage expanded beyond anything that should have been possible. The sounds she made were wet, organic, like meat being reshaped by invisible hands. But the worst part was that she was still conscious, still Ashley, still aware of every horrific change happening to her body. I should have pulled the trigger then. Should have ended her suffering before the thing she was becoming could fully emerge. But I thought about Emma in her hospital bed, thought about Sarah's desperate texts, thought about all the times I'd chosen duty over family. I thought about bringing someone home alive for once. "Ashley, listen to me. I'm going to get you out of here. I'm going to..." Her head snapped toward me with predatory focus, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "So hungry. Marcus, your daughter, tastes like fever dreams." Every rational thought in my head evaporated. My finger found the trigger, but Ashley was already moving, unfolding from the hollow with impossible speed and grace. What emerged wasn't human anymore. It was 8 feet of corded muscle and jutting bone, with arms that had become something between wings and claws. The Wendigo that had once been Ashley Morgan launched itself at me with a shriek that shattered every window in my mental defenses. I fired 3 rounds center mass, but the bullets passed through its transformed flesh like it was made of smoke and shadow. Then it was on me, claws raking across my chest hard enough to shred my uniform and the Kevlar vest beneath. I hit the ground hard, my radio and GPS unit scattering into the underbrush as the creature pinned me down with weight that shouldn't have been physically possible. Up close, I could see the remnants of Ashley's humanity still fighting inside the monster. Her eyes would flicker between predatory yellow and human blue, her ruined mouth forming words that came out as inhuman snarls. "Help me," she managed, even as her claws tightened around my throat. "Can't control." I reached for my backup pistol, but my arm wouldn't obey. My peripheral vision had collapsed to a tunnel barely wide enough to see Ashley's tortured face, and I could taste copper flooding my mouth as her claws punctured skin. That's when I heard it. Emma's voice, impossible and clear as if she was standing right beside me. "Daddy, the hungry trees are coming for Mommy too. What would you do in this situation? Would you keep fighting or try to save what's left of Ashley's humanity? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more supernatural ranger stories." The voice gave me strength I didn't know I had left. I drove my knee up into the Wendigo's midsection and rolled sideways as its grip loosened. My backup weapon was in my hands before conscious thought caught up, and this time I didn't aim for center mass. I aimed for Ashley's human eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The Wendigo's shriek cut off mid-note. The creature collapsed backward, Ashley's transformed body folding in on itself as whatever supernatural force had been reshaping her finally released its hold. For a moment she looked almost human again. A young woman in torn hiking clothes, lying peacefully in the moss beneath an ancient tree. Then the forest started to change around me. The trees began to move, not swaying in wind but actually uprooting themselves and walking on networks of exposed roots like wooden spiders. The ground beneath my feet turned soft and wet, and when I looked down, I realized I was standing on a carpet of human hair and fingernails that stretched in every direction. My radio crackled to life with a dozen overlapping voices, missing hikers from the past decade, all calling for help, all begging to be found, and underneath it all, growing stronger, was Emma's voice. "Daddy, it's in the hospital now. It's in Mommy, it's in me." I ran. I crashed through the transforming forest, branches that had become grasping fingers tearing at my clothes and skin. My GPS was gone, my radio useless, my backup supplies scattered somewhere behind me. But I knew these woods, had walked every trail for 12 years, and muscle memory guided me toward the trailhead even as reality warped around me. The forest fought me every step. Trees moved to block my path, roots erupted from the ground to tangle my feet, and the air itself seemed to thicken into something I had to push through like water. But I kept moving, kept fighting, because Emma was calling for me and Sarah needed me and I'd already failed them too many times. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the parking area, I almost collapsed with relief. My Ranger vehicle was still there, keys in the ignition, radio working. I called in Ashley's location and cause of death. Animal attack, I told them, which wasn't entirely a lie. Then I drove home to find Sarah packing Emma's things for another hospital stay. "Where were you?" Sarah asked without looking up. "I've been calling for hours." "I found her," I said. "The missing girl. I brought her home, but I hadn't brought Ashley home, had I? I'd left her body in the woods for the search team to recover, left her family with the knowledge that their daughter had died alone and afraid in the darkness beneath an ancient tree. I'd chosen to save myself instead of finding a way to save her. That night, holding Emma while she coughed herself to sleep, I realized the Wendigo hadn't been Ashley at all. It had been me, the hunger to always choose the job over family, to always put strangers before the people who needed me most. Ashley had just been the latest victim of my own monstrous priorities. Emma recovered eventually. The fever broke a week later, and the doctors never did figure out what had been wrong with her. Sarah and I went to counseling, worked on rebuilding what my obsession with work had nearly destroyed. I took early retirement from the National Park Service and got a job with the local fire department, still helping people but with regular hours and backup protocols that meant I came home every night. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when Emma's asleep and Sarah's reading beside me, I hear Ashley's voice on the wind outside our windows. Still calling for help, still trapped in those woods because I chose to save myself instead of finding a way to save her humanity. The thing about being a ranger is that you tell people you're there to protect them from the wilderness, but the real truth is that you're there to protect the wilderness from them. And sometimes Sometimes you have to protect them from what they become when they've been hungry too long. So there you have it. My encounter with something that should only exist in stories. Did I make the right choice? Would you have tried to save Ashley differently? Tell me in the comments and subscribe if you want more supernatural stories from someone who learned the hard way that the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the woods. They're the ones we become when we stop caring about the people who matter most.